Anderson.
You know, if you've listened to Point of View, you know that oftentimes we talk about the need for us to be able to articulate a biblical worldview and also to know how to defend a biblical worldview. And that second idea is what we oftentimes call apologetics. But if you've been listening to this program any length of time, you know that some people that do the area of apologetics sometimes have said we need to begin to rethink and maybe reframe and maybe, to use the word of the book we're going to talk about, reimagine apologetics. Now, does that mean that the message of the gospel has changed? No. Does that mean the truthfulness of Christianity has changed? No. But it does mean that the culture has changed, and in many ways, this 21st century world is kind of like the first century world. I've oftentimes said on this program that the centuries following the first century are very different than the first century, and now we find ourselves in a century not unlike that first century where Christianity isn't a majority. Christianity isn't even seriously considered. Christianity is oftentimes seen as a negative, as it was in the first century. And so maybe we need to come back to some of those principles, and I think along the way maybe we've lost some of those. So that's one of the reasons we're going to talk about this new book, Telling a Better Story. It's published by Zondervan, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age, and it is written by Dr. Joshua Chatraw. If you're not familiar with him, you may have seen some of his books like Apologetics at the Cross or Truth Matters or Cultural Engagement. Some of those, of course, he's co-authored with. This one he's written by himself. Has a Ph.D. from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, serves as the executive director of the Center for Public Christianity, but he's also the theologian in residence at Holy Trinity Anglican Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dr. Chatraw, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kerby. It's good to be here.
Let's, if we can, maybe get into how this book came about, because at the introduction there, it is interesting that Mark Allen says you sat down, and this is, I guess, 6 years ago now, talked about this idea of wanting to reimagine apologetics. And so after numerous meetings at Starbucks and at breakfasts and things like that, this book began to unfold, but a lot of that was due in large part to the concern that you had that we really find ourselves in a very different set of circumstances as we try to proclaim the gospel. Give us some background, if you might.
Yeah. Mark Allen's a great colleague. He's a PhD from Notre Dame, and he's also a pastor for 20 years. And so as we began to think through these issues, one of the things we realized is there was a way that we were both teaching at a university at the time, and there was a way that students were being trained to have conversations, which, to be kind of frank about it, we felt like might have worked 30 or 40 years ago, but just was not our experience, both for me doing college ministry and then in the church, and not for Mark for 20 years as a church planner and a pastor. And so one of the things we saw that had changed was, as you mentioned in your opening there, Kerby, that there was a time where the culture was warm to Christianity, even if you didn't buy that story of the resurrection, if you didn't even buy even this kind of notion that there is a God. Many people still saw Christianity as a social good, and so you could kind of pop in some arguments there, or maybe in many cases just give the gospel, call for repentance, and then refer them to the experts if they had any questions. But now the goodness and the beauty of the story of Christianity is seen as something that's not simply neutral, but something that many people don't see as good for society. And so when you're trying just to kind of jump to maybe kind of traditional arguments, you don't get much of a hearing. And so we began to say, okay, we need to help students actually be able to do this. And of course, that came from us doing it as well. And so that's kind of the background of how this book got going.
And more than once on this program, we've had one or two, or maybe even more, apologists that we interview say that it used to be the question was, is Christianity true? Now the question, as you pointed out, is Christianity good? And so it is very different. But early on in the book, you talk about the need to listen closely. That kind of relates to a conversation we just had last hour, because in some respects, listening and understanding what the issue is, what the barrier is, what the, if you will, concern is going to be even more important, don't you think, here in this 21st century world?
Yeah, and I would say, absolutely, and to add to that, I would say listen for what people are really wanting. What are the aspirations underneath what they're saying? And I think you hear this, for instance, with this, in what's going on right now in the United States, is people really want justice, and I think we should listen to that. We should do a lot of listening, and then say, okay, how, what story best makes sense out of this need for justice, or these notions of what we really need is the love. Well, let's do a lot of listening to that, but then at the right time say, what do we mean by love, and what story about the world, about the cosmos, best makes sense of this strong intuition we have that there is something good about loving each other. And so it's about listening, and then, hey, maybe there's something actually, and I think there is, buried about being human, about the kind of key features of personhood, especially in a culture that has been impacted by the gospel, it's part of the background. Even if people deny Christianity, it's very difficult to escape some of these kind of assumptions of Christianity once it gets into the bloodstream of a culture. So let's listen carefully to the aspirations, and then be prepared to step into those and have conversations about them.
One of the things you talk about is the opportunity in post-Christendom. And I noticed that when I was speaking on college campuses. I don't do that now because I'm doing this radio show every day, but let's just go down the road from you, at Chapel Hill. Oh, I've heard it all before because I'm kind of surrounded by a lot of Christians. You go to a place like a Princeton or something like that, and they go, I've really never met a Christian, so I'd kind of like to know what you have to say. There is a sense in which, because the world has changed and because some of the false ideas of Christianity are sort of leaking out, I'm running into lots and lots of young people, especially in the Gen Y or the Gen Z conversations, that say, I've never been to church. I really don't know Christians. So really, what do you guys really believe? And there's a sense of openness that hasn't existed, which in the past, it's, oh, yeah, you're just going to tell me something I already know because, I know Christians and I don't like them and I don't want to be one of them. So in some respects, this book, even though it recognizes that we live in a very different kind of postmodern, post-Christian world, presents an opportunity. So when we come back, we're going to break it down a little bit more. Part one is a better story about apologetics. Part two is offering a better story. And then part three, as you might imagine, is objections to the story. So we're going to take our time to kind of work through some of this. If you find yourself saying, this is a book I'd kind of like to read, it's a little over 200 pages. It's published by Zondervan. We have information about it on our website at pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
No doubt you've heard the phrase politics is downstream from culture. It is a way of explaining that what is at stake in our world often begins upstream in the culture. Popular culture is all around us and delivered to us through broadcast media and social media. We perceive the world through news reports, through movies, through entertainment programs, and through music. Every form of communication has a message. Sometimes it's blatant and intentional. Often it is subtle and not even perceived by the artist, actor, musician, or broadcaster. He or she may simply be telling a story, but that story comes from a worldview perspective. A wise and discerning Christian should frequently ask, what message is being delivered? Is the viewpoint true or false? How does it line up with biblical principles? But let's face it, many of us merely accept what we read, see, and hear uncritically. And that brings us to politics. We are bombarded by messages every day. Most Americans watch lots of television, listen to a fair amount of music, and visit various websites. Unless they are approaching all of the entertainment with lots of discernment, they'll begin to accept the worldview perspective of the writer, the actor, the director, the musician who controls the story and the perspective. Most of these stories come from a liberal, secular viewpoint that often becomes easier to embrace. If someone stood up and lectured to you about abortion, homosexuality, gender identity, your guard would be up. But if the stories portray liberals, feminists, and gays in a positive light, they get into our head and emotions. And if they portray conservatives and Christians in a negative light, the same thing happens. All this to say that we need to pay attention to popular culture because politics is downstream from culture. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation today with Joshua Chatraw as we talk about telling a better story, how to talk about God in a skeptical age. It's published by Zondervan, and I think you're going to find it very helpful as he's helping us kind of reimagine this idea of apologetics. And Dr. Chatraw, in the first section, you talk about a better story about apologetics. And actually, near the end of that section, there's a great diagram, but maybe you can kind of explain it. Kind of the idea of a building block apologetics versus an inside-out apologetics. Because in some respects, we've always sort of started with, logic and the arguments for the existence of God and historical evidence for Jesus and the gospel. And not that that's wrong, but in this world, there may be a better way to begin to communicate that. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah. I think obviously our arguments for God and using logic is really important, and so that's part of the approach I'm suggesting for our moment. But I think oftentimes what happens is we have a larger story that we've either assumed. Oftentimes, people we talk to, whether they realize it or not, have assumed a story about the world, and then they fit their kind of logic within that. They fit their kind of value system within that, and what's meaningful and what's significant and what's beautiful and what's good. And so if you're simply saying, I'm going to start from logic and argue up, oftentimes it's this bigger story that's dictating the moves they make. If they're actually kind of trying to work this out consciously, oftentimes it's working out subconsciously. So what we suggest is when you come into a conversation, or even if you're speaking to a group, you try to get a sense of what are really the dominant cultural stories, especially for the group you're talking to or the person you're talking to. And so there's these different stories. Some of them are micro stories, and all you have to do is watch some movies, and you pick this up, the story of achievement. You are what your CV, your resume says you are. The story of consumerism, you are what you buy. The story of romance, I think these are the stories that fill not only the songs we listen to, but the movies we watch. And they become kind of the defining narrative that people live by. And also there's these kind of grand stories, the kind of story about, there is no God, and therefore there is no meaning, and therefore just do whatever you want. Now that's a hard pill to swallow, and oftentimes we hear more of an optimistic secular story in these days, which is there is no God, therefore we define our own meaning, and that's a really exciting thing. And so what I'm suggesting in the book is let's listen for these stories, and those are just a few examples of them, and then try to enter in those stories and ask and learn to ask the right questions. And so learn to look for those aspirations I mentioned in the last segment, and to begin to talk to someone and about, what they find meaningful, what they find valuable, what their hopes are for the future. Is there really any significance in anything that we do as humans? And then begin to find what we can affirm. Is there something here we can affirm? But then what can we challenge? What, if you take to the logical conclusion, is going to cause them a lot of discomfort and problems? And then how do we then take them out from their story to the gospel story, to tell a better story, where they really can find the love, true love that they were made for as human beings, where they can really find meaning that even suffering can't take away. They can find true justice from a God who one day will return to bring justice to the world. So I think the aspirations are buried in these stories, and we have to learn how to interact with them rather than just be a kind of approach to apologetics, which is us versus them. How do we come along and think with them?
Well, and it does seem to me that what you also are doing is, when you're asking the question, helping them to understand the basis upon which they're living their lives. Let's take the most negative one, what you call the pessimistic secular story, that the whole world came into existence because of a big bang. There is no good, no bad. There just is. We're just, in a sense, pieces of DNA moving around. We have a brain, which is a meat computer that we use to come up with ideas. And I think it seems to me the question that you have is, well, where do you get any meaning or significance out of that? For that matter, if you believe that all you are is more evolved than the animals, or just more along the evolutionary chain than the rocks around you, why is there any value in human beings? Why would you be concerned about racism or genocide or sexual trafficking or anything? Sooner or later, they got to go, okay, yeah, it bothers me. I've got to think about that. And that sort of then gets you into that whole idea of imagining a better meaning, because if you take that one and say, gosh, there really isn't any meaning to life, there's no reason, if I really accept that worldview of getting out of bed in the morning, that starts them down a path, doesn't it, in terms of self-examination and maybe being more open to the gospel?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kerby. And I think the way you described it there is really good, because one of the things that I point out in the book is often for a variety of reasons, we feel pushed back in the culture. We feel intimidated at times. I think at times Christians, we can have an inferiority complex, and we need to admit that. But when we go into the conversation thinking, I'm about to pulverize this other person with my Christian worldview, you can understand where they're going to kind of not want to listen to you. And I think instead, I feel really good about our argument here. So let's just, take a deep breath and let this other person talk and engage them and say, hey, what do you do for meaning? Tell me about that. Where do you get your meaning in life? And I think they'll say things we can affirm. My kids, philanthropic things I do, I find value. I think there's a lot of things we can say, that's great. But if we're just assigning meaning, and ultimately there's no ultimate meaning in that, our relationships aren't going to last forever, as good as they are. And sometimes they fall apart. And when we begin to kind of press into these existential features of personhood, the story begins to unravel. There becomes cracks in their story. And I think that at that time, it's an opportunity to apply the gospel. And so what you're not having to do is go through this huge chain of argumentation. We have to become better listeners. And then where are the cracks at here? Where are the cracks in their, or the language I use in the book, or where are the holes in their plot line? They've got holes in their storyline. And then often they're actually borrowing from Christianity and they don't know it. So here's a real opportunity for, yeah, go ahead, Kerby.
No, I was going to say that's really the key point, is that, as we've talked about before, what they tend to do is they think that they're living consistently with their worldview. But in order to even make judgments about good or bad or meaning or happiness, they have to borrow from Christianity, don't they?
Well, and at least theism, right? I mean, at least theism, but
at least some kind of,
at least some belief in God or transcendence. But particularly when you're talking about what one philosopher calls the kind of modern moral order, things like human rights, and we, I talk about human rights in the book, or
sure,
universal benevolence, which is basically saying it's not just that we should care about other people that are in your neighborhood that happen to, if I treat them nice in my neighborhood, they'll treat me nice, and our neighborhood will get together, get along better. But no, the modern moral order says, no, we need to treat everybody with love and respect and with dignity, even if we don't know them, even if, me treating them well isn't going to have any immediate value for me. Okay. And so once you adopt these, which secular humanism, this kind of optimistic story about the world today has, I think there's this really good scholars and really good historians who've made the case really strongly that those have been injected into our culture a long time ago, in the first century with this man named Jesus.
That's right.
And at times it has taken, some things have popped up really quick. People have drawn certain implications more immediately, and sometimes this took longer. And to the church's shame, we didn't see some of the implications of his message, but it is in our culture. And so I have this line in the book. I think I say something like, your your non-Christian friends might be more Christian than you realize, or they realize.
We've seen
and
that before.
I'm not saying that everyone is, a born again believer. Actually, no, I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is they have imbibed some Christian assumptions and beliefs, and they don't even know it.
And you can show them the connections.
So,
let me take a break because I want to come back and talk about this idea of offering a better story, because 5 points, imagining better meaning, better true self, a better happiness, better inclusiveness, better reasons. And then we'll get into some of the objections to the story. And we just have one of those mandatory breaks. So we'll take a break and come back and spend a little more time talking about this book, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age. All that coming up right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Joshua Chatraw as we talk about his book, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age, published by Zondervan. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but as always, we have a link on our website. You can get it in paperback or Kindle. Some great material and just a number of accolades from various individuals, some of whom have been on the program with us before. And I thought it might be good, if nothing else, Joshua, to just maybe spend a little bit of time talking about the middle section. It's kind of the meat of the book, imagining a better meaning, imagining a better true self, happiness, inclusiveness, reason. Let's talk about this idea of imagining a better meaning. And almost immediately you talk about when nothing seems to be missing. You know, we run into some individuals. We even had a testimony the other day of an individual that had achieved incredible levels of success in the sports world, that then at the end, when you're at the pinnacle, it's still really empty. But I also run into some people that go, you know, I'm pretty good with my life. You know, I don't feel too like I have much of a need at all. So how do we begin to approach the self-satisfied person, and then also the individual that as they're maybe going along trying to achieve some level of success, finally sense that sense of emptiness, which only could be satisfied by a commitment to Jesus Christ?
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a real problem. I mean, I think there's a kind of a spiritual apathy that we're facing, where people just don't, when they say, you know, I don't see the relevance. I think this is what's behind that. When you hear that talking to someone who says, I just don't see how Christianity is relevant. And I think with that, they're saying, listen, I don't have any needs. I'm good. And when you achieve a certain technological success, you know, when you're on this side of the Enlightenment, and we're looking at all that we kind of have going for us, and if you're in a certain socioeconomic class, you know, this becomes a possibility in a way that it wasn't for most people of all human history. Kind of this to be like, oh, you know, I don't find any relevance in the notion of God or transcendence, to just be kind of foreign. So like I said, like we began this conversation, like there's some kind of unique challenges in that. And I think one of the things, though, is kind of, to go back to our previous segment, is that buried within, they're still living with some kind of purpose. And oftentimes, because maybe they're not experienced suffering or tragedy at the moment, they don't feel the existential weight of death. And I think death has this way of kind of waking us up. I mean, I think moments of unrest like we're experiencing has this kind of, okay, hang on, what's going on? So, you know, pain and suffering has tended people to you know, draw people away from God, yes, at times, but also draw people to God. And I think, so one of the things I'm trying to do in this chapter is I find that there's certain pressure points.
Right. And
like a good doctor, we need to be careful, right? Because we can come in and say, well, you don't have any purpose, you don't have any meaning. And, you know, they're going to quickly list off things that they find, you know, that they've created for purpose and meaning. But I think instead we can acknowledge that, yes, those things that they're pursuing I can understand why those are important, and those are, we can acknowledge at a certain level those are good things, but they're also really fragile things too. And what happens when those things start slipping away and we feel the anxiety and the weight of possibly losing the very things, the very webs of meaning that we've built for ourselves? And what happens when we start feeling, as we are now, I mean, many are today, like things unraveling around us? And I think very quickly in that there's this kind of, it can be this despair and this reaching for something more, what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls a sense of fullness that's lacking in our present moment. And I think those are opportunities. Let's keep our ears open and look for those opportunities to kind of apply the right amount of pressure on those pressure points of purpose, of the sense of our fragility and death, and then take them to the gospel. And I think this gospel story is there in their background, if they're in Western culture. And I also think it's somewhere buried deep in the human soul. So let's have confidence in that story, that it is the true story of reality, and connect it up with these pressure points.
And this idea of imagining a better meaning is kind of a cultural assumption that I don't need God or religion. But let's take the next one then, true self. The cultural assumption there is, well, you have to be true to yourself. But how do you respond to somebody that simply says, well, that's, I just got to be true to what I believe, and I don't really need anything other than that? You take them through some questions like justice and a variety of morality and others. And so talk about how that might be used in a way to reach out to the unconvinced.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you start saying this kind of, as long as I'm true to myself, that's, everyone's got to be true to themselves. And I think what we want to say there is, well, several things. One is, if you imagine that by saying there somehow you can look at this core part of your humanity that's not attached to everything going on external to you, that's just impossible. We are historical embodied beings. And with that, it means we're always going to be affected by what's going on around us. A story that I sometimes say was when I was in middle school and I was kind of trying to find myself, maybe if we use this expression, trying to find a true me, if I was jumping from kind of one middle school subgroup to another and I was rebelling, I would never kind of show up in a toga, to school or something. It was always, there was limited possibilities of who I was going to dress like and who I was going to try to imitate. And so when we say, I'm going to try to find the true me, and you're always looking around to the external world. So you can't do it is one thing. It's also when you're trying to do it, there's this fragility to that, because if you're just basing it on emotions, well, our emotions are always, are in flux. And so there's this instability of always kind of trying to say, okay, how do I feel today? And that's the true me. And so we are looking to external stories is the reality. And so let's name that. Let's say we actually are doing that. And then how are those stories that people are telling that we're looking to of, that we see in Disney movies or Nike commercials, how are they doing about giving us a stable identity or morality or or justice? How are they, do they actually provide these fundamental features, I would say, of personhood? How are they actually giving us those things? So if you take, for instance, justice, in order to really get at justice, we need to think through, do we have a grounds for justice? Is there,
Yes.
We talk about universal human dignity and our obligation to care for others, or what story actually gives us a ground? Because if it's just look inside yourself, then there is no obligation to treat others with justice. If when I look inside myself, I want to do what I want to do. In other words, if we don't have this obligation to pursue justice according to a certain standard, then what we have is the story that the culture is saying, just look inside yourself, is actually in tension with this other story that we're saying, which is we need to get justice. And so I think the Christian story, and this is what I try to do in the book, actually gives us a true solid identity that we can have stability with, and also gives us a story for justice. So we're not just swept away by the cultural stories that are fleeting and coming and going, really at a rapid pace these days.
Let's, if we can, take a break, and we come back. I want to get into one of the larger chapters, Imagining a Better Happiness. The ultimate goal in life is to be happy. Oh, have we heard that before? And I just wanted to, if nothing else, talk about that. And these are all part of the section on offering a better story. And, of course, there's also some great material about objections to the story as well. And if you find yourself saying, oh, this might be something very helpful, I'm really kind of wanting to think about, is there a better way to present the gospel? Is there a way to tap into some of the cliches that I hear? I just want to be happy. I just have to be true to myself. Well, I don't really need God. All the sorts of other ideas. These really provide, I think, a great starting point. A lot of it, of course, involves the ability to listen. and to interact, and then to be able to address some of the questions or objections. But if nothing else, I just thought that it would be very helpful, because we are living in a time where people aren't so much asking, is Christianity true? They're asking, is it good? And frankly, most of them aren't even asking. They just simply say, I'm fine without a religion, don't really see any need for it, and if that's good for you, great, but it's not even relevant to my life. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about how maybe to scratch some of those places where there's a potential itch that they don't know, to begin to raise some questions, some issues, to get some deeper thought. And even if we don't get the great answers today, we might put a pebble in their shoe and get them thinking about that as they walk along in life. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Now, for a few more minutes, as we talk about the book, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age. Dr. Joshua Chatraw with us as we talk about one of the other chapters, Imagining a Better Happiness. Now, both of the ones we've just talked about, that is, I don't really need God, and I got to true to myself, are certainly significant ones. But one that you certainly run into oftentimes is the ultimate goal in life is to be happy. And it's this idea that I have kind of a moralistic, therapeutic deism. You know, maybe there's a God, maybe not, but my happiness is the big issue. And frankly, for some of them, they may not articulate it, but they're thinking, if I become a Christian, well, that's not going to make me happy. It's going to make me have to do all sorts of things and believe all sorts of things I don't want to believe. So how do we do that? And how do we engage individuals who are convinced that the ultimate goal in life is happiness?
Yeah. Well, again, I think this is one of those opportunities for us to kind of have to think carefully and to think with some nuance. There's a work by a sociologist by the name of Philip Reif in the 1960s called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And he said one of the things that's going on is, and I think his book was prophetic, was that this quest to feel better would overshadow the quest for justice, for things like justice and forgiveness and redemption. And so as long as we feel better, and I think, every time somebody says, as long as you're happy, I think maybe Philip Reif's thesis has been proven true. Now, I'm not saying that there's never a time where, in context, that's maybe okay, but
sure.
I think that has become a kind of dominant, well, whatever you want to do in this situation, as long as you're happy. And I think what ends up happening there is even among us as Christians, there can be a subtle shift within our assumption of how we're to live our life. Now, I do think that there's this notion of the good life, and I think Christianity does give the good life. It is the good life, but it's not working with the same type of category, so to speak. And so there's some contrast. Let me give you three contrasts, I would say, between the Christian story and then this other way to pursue the good life, or these other ways to pursue happiness. And I think one is that this type of therapeutic rationalism assumes that we can kind of just achieve happiness on our own. And the Christian story is much more realistic, I think, about what we see and about the human experience, which is that after the fall, that we're never going to actually get to perfect happiness until Christ returns. And so there's this realism that suffering and pain and loss is part of our plight now. And that's something that we have to deal with. And so we have to ask the question of how can we thrive in the midst of a world full of suffering and pain? I think Christianity actually gives us the resources to do that, and I go into the book and talk more about that. I think another contrast here is the Christian story sees physical pain and emotional distress as a kind of sign that there's something bigger underneath the surface. Right. And so, when you I love this quote from David Foster Wallace, who's a novelist, wasn't a Christian, but he says, he died about 10 years ago, but before his death, he said, in most cultures, if you hurt, it means that you're having symptoms that something deeper is wrong, that something in the system is wrong. And so it's like there's a fire alarm going off because there's a fire, not just simply because there's a fire alarm going off. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things going on in our narrative today is that, despite all our technology, despite all the kind of therapeutic practices, all the things that's going on, and, we sense that something is the matter in the world. Something is not right. Right. And you don't need to be a Christian to sense that. You sense it. We sense it deep in our bones. And what the Christian story does is it says, yes, that's right. There is something going on, but we can't just treat this symptoms. There's something deeper going on. And if we're just trying to eliminate this kind of external feeling, we never get at the cancer. And there's a lot of people who are doing writing from a secular perspective today who's trying to convince us that, no, really, everything is great. Everything is fine. This is the best time ever in human history. And I think, again, we need to be nuanced about this. I think they make some pretty good arguments on certain things, but if you look at the social fabric, if you look at relationships, I don't think you have to go very far in looking at mental health figures to realize, no, we've also got some big problems, despite all our technology and despite some gains in society. And then I think the last thing we need to say here, and that I say in the book as far as in contrast, is that the Christian story teaches the only way to find true joy is to deny yourself.
Yes.
I call this the paradox of joy.
Right. In
other words, if you're seeking out happiness as an end to itself, what actually happens is you don't get it.
Yeah.
But instead, the way that this is the fabric of the universe, that when you turn from self and you turn towards others, and you turn ultimately towards God, then what actually happens is you do experience this joy. It's still tinged with suffering and pain and the realities of this present world, but then something. This is the heart of the gospel, right? To find your life, you must lose it. And so this is actually the very fabric that we live by. And so I think people sense little glimmers of this, like when they altruistically give themselves to their kids,
right,
and they're non-believers. And it's in that, and they say, yes, I would give anything for my kids. And I say, what's the most, or for my spouse? And I say, is that the most flourishing relationship in your life? And oftentimes I say, without a doubt. And so here you have this little pointer, I think, this little sign that says, see, it's when we're giving ourselves, it's when we're giving ourselves self-sacrificially that we actually flourish. And what if that's the very fabric of the universe? Because our God, and then we can go theologically on them. The Christianity has said God in his very being is this God who exists in three in one. And he's always loved and always has been giving, is this self-giving God.
Very good.
And so the fabric of the universe is designed after the very character of God, and that forms the heart of our morality.
Well, it gives you a pretty good idea of the book. Of course, we have not looked at all of the chapters here, but we did try to at least give you a little bit of an idea of a better story about apologetics. We looked at a couple of better story offerings, and of course, there's a whole section there on objections. But if nothing else, I think it's really a call to rethink the way in which we communicate the gospel and how we do apologetics. So, Dr. Joshua Chatraw, thank you for being with us here on Point of View. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an entire hour just to spend some time digging into it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, we need to take a break, and let me just mention real quickly that we've got all sorts of information that we always post on the website at pointofview.net. First of all, of course, the viewpoints section, which is my viewpoints today, so you can take the time to print that out. And also, if you click on that button that says Read Now, you'll find a button that says Never Miss a Viewpoint, sign up here. And I know many of you probably have already received that in your email, but if you have never signed up, let me just give you that opportunity to do so, because that is one way in which you can receive these viewpoint commentaries on a regular basis. If you appreciate some of the conversation we've had already, you can do a couple of things. Number one, you can click on that red button that says Listen, and that is a way in which you can download this and listen to it. Or if you'd like to watch it, click on the button that says Watch, or later on, of course, you can go to the YouTube channel and find that as well. There is, of course, a button there for you to give, and if you would like to support this ministry, we certainly appreciate your financial support. We are dependent upon your gifts, but let's, if we can, take a break, and when we come back, going to get into some other important issues, but I hope that you'll take the time to visit the website pointofview.net, find some of the material we've posted there today. It is available to you free of charge, but we want you to use that in your ministry. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. Pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to this program any length of time, you know that we so often talk about a Christian worldview, and from time to time we also want to help you know how to evaluate other people's worldview. And so this hour we're going to spend some time talking about a new book that really helps you look at it maybe in a little different way. And so if this is something that you've wanted to apply in terms of your own teaching your kids, your grandkids, maybe you teach a Sunday school class, or maybe you just like to know more about it yourself, we're going to be talking about this new book called Inklings on Philosophy and Worldview, a new way of learning about our connections to truth and reality. It is written by Matthew Dominguez, who is an educational trainer and speaker. He has studied at Houghton College at Oxford and has a master's degree from the University of Illinois in Chicago. He is the director at Wheaton Academy in West Chicago, Illinois. He's been a professor and teacher of philosophy, literature, discipleship, and much more. And so we are privileged to have him join us today as we work our way through this book, which is published by Tyndale, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But we also have a link so that you can get it in paperback, Kindle, and a variety of other formats. So, Matthew, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby, for inviting me on.
Well, again, this is going to be kind of worldview, and I would encourage people, if they have something to write with, maybe put down IMMT, I for idealism, M for materialism, M for monism, and then T for theism, because in some respects what you do is you take us through some of the kind of worldviews that we are likely to run into, and then we take really kind of a test. We take some time looking at this whole idea of how those worldviews address the issue of reality, and then even talk about how, in some respects, Christianity gives a proper answer to that. Now, I know you've been teaching worldview for some time. This is a second kind of course, if you will, but talk about this, because this seems to be a way that can help, especially young people, but even us old people can benefit from this as well, learn these worldviews and begin to put them in proper categories.
Well, I appreciate you setting it up like that. Part of what I want is something that is simple to understand and something that we can really apply so that we can engage with pretty much anybody we bump into in a conversational and a loving way. And I think the 7 questions and the 4 worldviews make it really accessible for pretty much anybody.
Yeah, 7 questions, 4 worldviews, so it's easy to follow. But you start off with the word trust. And, of course, that also gets us into the word faith. And you know as well as I do that when I run into people that maybe are really into the scientific method, they might be in that materialistic worldview, they say, I believe in facts. The rest of you believe in faith. You point out very quickly that when you ask your students to come up with anything for which they have 100% certitude, it begins to diminish pretty quickly, because it isn't that we have all these facts over here and everything else is faith. Really, almost everything that we're going to talk about at one point or another requires a level of trust and faith, doesn't it?
That's the premise of the way that I teach worldview. And one of the things I love about us admitting and accepting that is it levels the playing field. I can't come, maybe even in an egotistical, I've got it right and they've got it wrong way. I have to humble myself and say, I'm trusting this, and what I'm trusting I believe is trustworthy. But then it allows me to also acknowledge that the other person is doing the same thing. And it creates a wonderful opportunity for unity, and it allows us to see each other eye to eye, which I think is really important. I like how you juxtaposed the science with faith. And I love Chesterton's quote here. He says, "It's idle to talk always of the alternative of reason and faith. Reason is itself a matter of faith. It is an act of faith to assert that our thoughts have any relation to reality at all."
By the way, I might just mention that if you love G.K. Chesterton, you're going to love this book because there's a lot of Chesterton quotes in it as well. But before we get into the meat of the book, you not only talk about faith, but you talk about a trust list. And even at the end of each one of your chapters, you have reflection questions, and some of those are about your personal trust list. You have a place where if somebody takes this, they can begin to say, I trust, I trust, I trust. So explain that. What is this idea of a trust list, and how do you take your students through it?
Well, I think in regards to my students, especially since I'm in a Christian school, it often comes to a surprise to them that we're believing in Jesus and that I'm believing in God. And I'm trusting that he's saving me. And so I think that's a great place for us, especially as Christians, to start, is that God doesn't say, if you can prove to everybody else that you're right, then I'll save you. Anyone who believes, anyone who trusts in me, then that's where the salvation comes. It comes through that connection. I like starting my students there. Because if they are willing to humble themselves and accept that they are believing, that they're trusting, then from there they build their trust list. Where did their beliefs come from? Well, I'm trusting my pastor. I'm trusting the Bible. And I'm not running around trying to prove that God exists to everybody else. I'm trusting that he does. I think that can be really scary. It often is pretty scary for juniors and seniors in high school. But the freedom comes when they bump into a friend or maybe another teacher, or if they head off to college and they bump into a professor who's not a believer and a believer, and they say, well, I can prove to you that there is no God. What I like empowering my students with is a loving response, a compassionate response, but also they don't need to be afraid of that because that professor is using their trust list.
Yes.
They're maybe trusting, whatever science, theory that they have. They're trusting their brain. They're trusting their friends. And again, by going through that process, it allows for this engagement with each other that's honest and open and dialogic, really.
Right. And again, doesn't set them up for failure. And I've seen that happen sometimes in Christian schools, so I appreciate the way you've done that. Just before we take a break, there is at least one thought that stops thought. That's the G.K. Chesterton quote. It's the thought that ought to be stopped, and that is the idea that some might say, well, since I can't prove anything, I can't believe anything because I have a lack of certitude, then everything's unverifiable, and I just go into some kind of depressed postmodern state. And you take that on as well.
Yeah, Chesterton writes about that in Orthodoxy. He calls it the suicide of thought. And I think it's really important to get there pretty quickly because much of our world is wrestling through what is trustworthy. And you can even see, like in 2020, that's bubbling up very quickly to the surface. And often, if we're honest with this and we acknowledge that we can't really verify anything with 100% certitude, falling into that suicide of thought is very scary.
Right.
John, one of the things that's helpful, though, is Chesterton, in that chapter, walks us through it, and we realize, wait a second, if I'm choosing to trust thoughts, and I'm trusting the thoughts that got me into this desperate state, well, then, wait a second, I'm choosing to trust this thought because I can't trust thoughts. Wait, that's a mirage.
It sure is.
A lie there, and I love being able to walk students through that, and you can just see the lights go on and smiles start coming because they're like, wait, someone tried to trick me with this. And then the beauty of it is if I'm choosing to trust that thought, there's a certain empowerment of, wait.
Yep. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we will continue our conversation as we talk about Inklings on Philosophy and Worldview. That coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
No doubt you've heard the phrase politics is downstream from culture. It is a way of explaining that what is at stake in our world often begins upstream in the culture. Popular culture is all around us and delivered to us through broadcast media and social media. We perceive the world through news reports, through movies, through entertainment programs, and through music. Every form of communication has a message. Sometimes it's blatant and intentional. Often it is subtle and not even perceived by the artist, actor, musician, or broadcaster. He or she may simply be telling a story, but that story comes from a worldview perspective. A wise and discerning Christian should frequently ask, what message is being delivered? Is the viewpoint true or false? How does it line up with biblical principles? But let's face it, many of us merely accept what we read, see, and hear uncritically. And that brings us to politics. We are bombarded by messages every day. Most Americans watch lots of television, listen to a fair amount of music, and visit various websites. Unless they are approaching all of the entertainment with lots of discernment, they'll begin to accept the worldview perspective of the writer, the actor, the director, the musician who controls the story and the perspective. Most of these stories come from a liberal, secular viewpoint that often becomes easier to embrace. If someone stood up and lectured to you about abortion, homosexuality, gender identity, your guard would be up. But if the stories portray liberals, feminists, and gays in a positive light, they get into our head and emotions. And if they portray conservatives and Christians in a negative light, the same thing happens. All this to say that we need to pay attention to popular culture because politics is downstream from culture. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
New book out and is published by Tyndale, Inklings on Philosophy and Worldview, a new way of learning about our connections to truth and reality. And we've worked our way through part 1, and we're going to focus a fair amount of time now on part 2, which is Philosophy and the Four Views of Reality. The author is Matthew Dominguez, who is, again, a teacher at Wheaton Academy in Illinois and a graduate of a number of universities, which we've mentioned. And this book is one that you can get both in paperback, Kindle, and a variety of other formats. And this second section deals with philosophy and four views of reality. And before we get into those different worldviews, you actually have a chapter talking about philosophy as a practical tool. For some people that maybe aren't familiar with philosophy or avoided classes in philosophy in high school or college, what about that? How do we use some of these philosophical ideas as a way to begin to evaluate these different worldviews that we run into?
Well, I mean, philosophy means the love of wisdom. And I think all of us are looking for a wise way to navigate each day. Every time we wake up, we have all these decisions bombarding us. So I found that philosophy is a nice practical tool to, the way that I've set it up is that we all have these questions, and they're hitting us all day. And when we realize that what we're trusting is affecting how we navigate each decision that we make, it becomes incredibly practical. We can think of the big questions in life, which I bring up here, but in the book, there's a part where my daughter asked me, what happened to the dog when the dog dies? That's a 4-year-old asking about death. That's a big philosophical question. Or even when we're asking kids in kindergarten to share, well, that's morality and trying to figure that out. And so I think a lot of us think that that's over there in the academic tower when really we're dealing with these big questions every day. And then we're also in such a global community that we are now bumping into different religions, different worldviews all the time on our phones, on the TV, in the hallways, and everywhere we go. So I think it's really important to have something that's simple and practical as we want to try and honor and love. Jesus says they'll know we are Christians by our love. So how can we have a nice, loving way to honor others as we talk to them about what they trust and what they believe?
And again, because we are in this sort of global village, remember Rudyard Kipling said, east is east and west is west. No longer, because you are confronted, especially if you go out on the internet, even if you turn on your television set, you are going to be confronted with a lot of different worldviews. And what you've done is broken it down into 4. So we're going to look at 4 kind of categories of worldviews, and there are subcategories underneath each one of those, obviously. And then we're going to look at those 7 questions. But let's go through that, because the first one is idealism. And what you say is that pure idealism views only the spiritual as really real. Now, I don't tend to run into people too often like that, but that is certainly a philosophical option, isn't it?
Yes, and I think if we open up to using, instead of comparative religion, which is fantastic, if we approach connecting with other people on just what's really real, the material realm or the spiritual realm, then from there we can build a conversation. And there are people on our planet, I think definitely a hardcore Buddhist is going to say that this material realm is something that we're trying to escape. We want to escape to a perfect place somewhere else in the spiritual realm, right?
And so that fits into that category, or where they see the world is a cosmic dance or Maya, and so that is the case. Or, of course, even the idea of the Matrix or something else, that you think this is real, but there's really something else. So that's kind of the idea of pure idealism. But the second one, which I know we're going to probably camp out a lot more, authentic materialism, which trusts only in the measurable material realm. The reality is, Matthew, is a typical student, if he or she goes off to college, sits in a classroom, you can probably assume that the professor is going to actually lecture from that worldview. If you open up kind of a standard newspaper, you go and watch various programs that are on television, most of those are going to be coming probably from sort of kind of a materialistic worldview, aren't they?
I would think so, yes, especially in the North American Western culture, where we've landed on really trusting our senses, trusting what we can see and touch and feel, and trusting the cause and effect nature of the world around us.
And so then the next one is what you call complete monism. That accepts both the spiritual and physical realms as real, but there's a unity and no distinctions. Now, that gets you into some of the Eastern religions. It gets you into maybe the New Age movement. And as soon as we talked about the fact that you would assume that most of your professors would hold to a materialistic worldview, I am starting to notice, if you go on to various college campuses, which is where I assume many of your students head, some of the professors are really, in a sense, espousing something more like monism than materialism. So what does that look like?
Well, and if you don't mind, I'll kind of give context to that. So we all are looking at the world of ideas, and ideas are powerful. The idea of a car could last way beyond the car itself in the material realm. But then we go to materials, and we're looking at the material realm saying, yeah, this is real. I'm pounding the desk, right? That's what we're hearing. And so there's something real here as well. And I think what the monism piece highlights is that, wait, there is a connection between us and in the world. There is a unity. And I think it's interesting that sometimes we shy away from, oh no, this is going to sound New Age because they're talking about the spirit that unites all things. But often in my classrooms when I say, wait a second, Paul says that, right, that Christ is in all things and through all things and holds all things together. And David says, where can I go to get away from your spirit? I can't go anywhere because you're where? Everywhere. And so there is a unity. Paul talks about the unity in the body of Christ. Well, when we get to theism, we also acknowledge a distinction. But what monism talks about is there is this unity, and I think you're right. There's a sense of that our world is noticing there has to be more going on than just this material realm. The material realm is in our faces, and we have a body, but there's something spiritual, and that is definitely on the rise.
Well, and that, of course, brings us to the one you just mentioned, that is religious theism, which, again, recognizes the reality of both the spiritual and material realms, but also with those distinctions, because, again, while you certainly recognize that there is a way in which we as finite creatures can enter into the spiritual by praying, for example, and how those individuals, God came into history, both space and time, both through revelation, his word, and through the person of Jesus Christ, we see some distinctions that are sort of missing with some of the other worldviews, correct?
Yeah, and so you realize the difference between idealism, people believing that God is more like an idea or a concept. He's truth, right? But when you think of nirvana, you can't give nirvana a hug or a high five. You get to theism, Mary Magdalene is hugging the truth. Like God, and especially in the Trinitarian sense, is more than just a concept.
Yes. So we are going to take a break. When we come back, though, we now have put the 4 particular worldviews on the table. Let me just mention the 7 questions, and then we will work our way through those. And the first one is kind of what is the nature of reality? What is real? Sort of been already talking about that. Number 2, who or what is God? And you can see how you're going to get very different answers from those different worldviews. The third one is what is a human being? What is humankind? In other words, the whole idea of human nature. How does that relate? Number 4 is the issue of ethics. What is the basis of and standard for morality? How do I decide between right and wrong? And who or what is the basis of morality? So, very important question there. Number 5, what happens to humans at death? Number 6, what is the meaning and purpose of human history? What is the essence of human interaction and relationships? Is history circular or linear or meaningless in that regard? And then number 7, why are we here? Where are we going? What is the purpose of human existence? And what is the purpose of living for tomorrow? And so, as you can see, those are really big, fundamental questions. And so we're going to come back and spend some time talking about how each one of those worldviews tries to answer each one of those questions, and how that gives you, I think, a great evangelistic opportunity, apologetics opportunity to share your faith with other individuals. And it's all part of this new book, Inklings on Philosophy and Worldview, a new way of learning about our connection to truth and reality. It is published by Tyndale, and if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get a copy of that book, we will certainly encourage you to go to the website. I think it would be a great thing for you to go through individually, but it's written in such a way that it could really be a great study that you could do with individuals in your sphere of influence. So let's take a break. We will continue our conversation right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Matthew Dominguez as we talk about his book, Inklings, on philosophy and worldview. We've looked at the idea of trust and the nature of reality. At the moment, we're looking at philosophy and the 4 views of reality with these 7 essential questions. And then if we have some time, we'll look at the next section, which is Christ, the fullness of reality, and the whole idea of light and how that fits. But first of all, Matthew, let's see if we can maybe look at some of those questions. One of those is the nature of reality, what is real? And that's immediately where you see a stark difference between how these 4 different worldviews address the issue of reality.
Yeah, I think, and that's important because sometimes I have people, at a conference or even in a classroom or a parent say, well, wait, it seems like you're just kind of adopting that all the truth out there is one big truth. And really, when we look at these 4, anyone who takes some time to process it will realize that not all the religions are saying the same thing. Not all worldviews are the same right at the core.
Yes, and that's important because, you go into a typical Religion 101 class oftentimes in major universities, and I've had professors say, all the religions are basically the same. I mean, they differ on some little details, but they're all trying to find God. And I'm going, yeah, they only differ on heaven, hell, God, salvation, and a variety of other incidental issues here. These are fundamentally, if you will, exclusive views. And so talk about this. How do these 4 worldviews address this issue of reality?
So I would say that what I want to set up here is they address the issue of reality by what they're trusting to be real, and then we can follow from there the consequences of that trust. And so idealism is going to trust that the ideas, the spiritual realm, is the real thing. And so for many of us, people have heard that when you die, your life is done, which is a materialist approach. But the idealist would say, actually, when you die and you let go of the body and the material realm, that's when life really starts. The spiritual realm is the real thing. Materialism is saying, you know what, that's all a lie. That's a fabrication, that's imagination. And, C.S. Lewis even said when he was an atheist that's a beautiful lie. But when we look at the material realm, we're saying that the only thing that's real is what we can measure. It's the waves, it's the chemicals, it's the periodic table of elements, and all the consequences and cause and effect of electrons running through everything. The monism is saying, no, there's a spiritual realm, there's a material realm, and you can even call what this life energy force is, you can call that God, but the difference here is that, God didn't make the world. We would say more like pantheism, God is the world. And since we're part of the world, then we're basically part of God, a finger or, a hair or just a piece of it, one big entity. And then theism is saying, no, wait a second. There's a real spiritual realm. There's a real material realm. And they're connected. But they're not to say there's actual distinction. I have a big painting, I'm staring at it right now in my classroom, of the Sistine Chapel with God and Adam. And one of my lessons talks about that little inch between those fingers. You look at God and Adam, and there's the image of God is right there in Adam, but there's a little separation, right? And I think that's an important distinction. I want to be like Jesus, but I'm not going to be Jesus. Jesus is Jesus.
Well said. Which brings us to the second question, who or what is God? Because all 4 of those worldviews come to very different answers, don't they?
Yes, they do. Actually, Tozer says your answer to that question is the most important thing about you. And I think this is one of those questions where we can look around the world today and start realizing how people approach that question really affects everything about who they are. And so if I believe that God is an idea and he's eternal and God is perfect, well then in order for me to live forever, I would need to become God. I would need to become that. Well, that's basically Buddhism and much of Hinduism. If I am an atheist and believe that there's no God, there's no spiritual realm, well then God's a vocabulary word, and I have to deal with other people in this world that do believe in God. And so that question is going to shape everything. And actually, if there's no outside objective authority in God, Where does authority come from? Is there any authority inside this internal system of cause and effect? Monism would say that, well, God is the world, God didn't make the world. So if I'm going to answer that question, who is God, and I land on the fact that I'm part of what is God, then I'm part of God, then maybe I'm God.
Mm-hmm.
Has massive implications, especially down to authority and morality, right?
Yes. And again, of course, the religious theist would say, God exists, but I'm distinct from God. And so he's the all-powerful creator, sustainer, and giver of life, and God is personal and has personality. So those are very different answers, but I thought we'd pick out a couple others. You know, this view of who human beings are, what is humankind, is very key, because an evolutionist is going to say, well, you're just a more evolved animal. But some of the other answers are, again, different from both the Christian view as well as the atheist evolutionary view, aren't they?
And I think this is where we get into the consequences, right? If I'm going to trust that there's no spiritual realm, okay, someone can trust that. And what I want to do is in a conversational way, talk a student through, you know what, I want you to be able to choose to trust what you want to trust. But if you're going to trust to be a materialist and trust to be an atheist, then what are the consequences of that? What is a human being then? I remember having a world-famous atheist in my classroom, and he read, you know, what do we have in here for what a human being is? And he read it, and he's like, you make me sound like I'm a sack of chemicals. And he goes, which I guess is what I am. You know, like he wasn't afraid of that, and he was willing to accept it. And then also process then, if that's true, the consequences of believing that are that there's no free will. Like a computer doesn't make its own choices. It's only responding to stimuli and electrons running through it. Well, what are the consequences of no free will? What happens when there's no, like morality then actually doesn't exist? And some students think, oh no, you're coming on hard on the atheist or the materialist. And actually, I'm not trying to build a straw man and knock it down. I'm just trying to say, if you believe that, then these are the consequences. And I just want you to know what you're believing so you can really understand how that fleshes itself out. And if they really do read atheists who are honest and sincere, those atheists will admit there's no free will. There's no, morality is absurd. Life is absurd and ridiculous. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it also relates to something else, and we'll take a break, and that is one of your other questions about morality, because if there is no objective standard and all of it is just choice and there's really no free will, first of all, we can't hold people accountable, yet the whole criminal justice system is based upon the idea that you did something, you knew it was wrong, and you should pay the penalty for it. But more importantly, I get all the time atheists say, well, I can be good without God. Yeah, don't deny that you can do good things. That's not what I'm saying. But you don't have an objective basis for that. And that's really what you're talking about in this fourth question, because either morality is based upon some objective view, or with the other worldviews, it's subjective, or in the case of materialism, it just is. Richard Dawkins, you know, there's no good, no bad. If DNA basically forces us to dance to its tune, and there's no good or bad, there's no evil, it just is. And so in some respects, that is a very depressing worldview when you realize not only there's no God, but there's no basis for right and wrong, and of course there's no eternal life. And that's why sometimes young people get so discouraged, because if you really embrace that worldview and see its consequences, it doesn't lead you to optimism and hope, does it?
Well, it's very challenging to find optimism and hope when there's no sense of autonomy and no chance to really choose that when you're stuck in that system. But I honor Dawkins in the fact that he was at least being open and honest about the consequences of chopping God out. I mean, Ecclesiastes talks about it, and it's in the Bible. If you remove God, then life is pretty much absurd and ridiculous. And the nice thing is that if we have this conversational tone, I can talk to Dawkins and say, oh, so if you're going to choose to trust that, then you accept these consequences. Okay, I want to choose to trust something else that has different consequences. And of course, if I'm going to trust that God is the authority figure, then that means I don't get to decide what morality is. I have to submit myself to what God says, you know, how his nature and his character and what he says are the rules for the best life possible.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we've talked about some of these questions. Of course, we can talk about, is there any meaning to death? Well, if you believe that you live, you die, and you become dirt, then that's not the case. History, well, again, if you don't believe that history is his story or God providing any direction, then it's just sort of meaningless. And most importantly, where are we going? But I wanted to get to the third section when we come back from the break, because in some respects now, how do we apply a Christian view? And Christ, the fullness of reality, is the third section. And it really helps us understand how to apply a Christian view to those worldviews. So we'll continue that conversation right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Matthew Dominguez as we talk about his book, Inklings, on Philosophy and Worldview. It is published by Tyndale, and of course, anytime you have a book of 200 pages, we won't cover all the chapters, but we have given you a little bit of a sense of what is in the first section, the first 5 chapters on trust and the nature of reality. Then we've been talking about part 2, philosophy and the 4 views of reality as well. But I wanted to focus, before we run out of time, on the this third section, Christ, the fullness of reality, and uses a great illustration. You can kind of think of a chandelier, and in the middle you've got this light, and it's Christ, who is, of course, the light of the world, and then you have some other smaller lights on that chandelier, and you use that, Matthew, as a way to, first of all, give us a sense that we as Christians have the light, and we should certainly always be prepared to make a defense, and we should do that in a gentle and respectful way, or with gentleness and respect, depending on which translation you have. And so you use this as a way of saying we can use our Christian view to gently, but hopefully with some intellectual integrity, challenge or begin to question some of the other views that we've just been talking about in terms of worldview. So how do we go about doing that?
I appreciate how you described that. Thanks so much. One of the keys to this whole approach was that love and honor and dignity and respect. And I remember growing up, like, thinking, okay, I've got the light of Christ, and then nobody else does, and so I got to go out there and tell them that they're all wrong. And there was some sense of, like, always an inkling, there's the word, that something's off there. And so the metaphor that's used is the chandelier, and so I can talk to my atheist friend, right? And they can talk about cause and effect in the material realm. And rather than me saying, well, you're wrong, and this view is correct, I can say, well, yeah, I agree. The material realm is really real. God created it. There is a lot of cause and effect in this. But if you're only going to believe in the material realm, you're missing out on all this other light that is available for you in the truth of Christ. Because Christ not only has a body in the material realm. If God puts on a body, matter matters all of a sudden, right? But also we have the Holy Spirit, who is uniting all of us, which is so fantastic. But then we also have Father God, who is this, perfect being with perfect standards. And then you start realizing, okay, they have just that one light on, but I can honor that. I can honor that light and then invite them in to seeing, look at the blessing of turning on these other lights, right?
Yes. And so, again, what you want to do is maybe find some bridges you can build. Sometimes we as Christians, even when we do apologetics, we build barriers, we build walls. And so on each one of those, you say there are lights on and lights off. So take us through that. You've done that a little bit with atheism, but what about idealism and monism? How do we maybe build some bridges and say, well, here's some places where we agree, and then you can begin to say, we do agree on this, but here's what the Bible says about some other things where we may disagree. How do we go about doing that?
Yeah, thanks. One of my favorite ones is with idealism. And in an international classroom here at Wheaton Academy, I have students flying in from all over the world, and I've had several Buddhists sitting in my class, and we walk through this. And I'm going to use the word fun. It's so fun to be able to honor them and say, hey, Grandma and Grandpa, and even many of your family members who are in Buddhism, they're striving for perfection. They believe in a real spiritual realm, in beauty, truth, and goodness. And I want to say, yes, so do I. And then they're going to say, yeah, and there's so much suffering in this world, and there's so much pain and brokenness. And I'll say, yeah, I agree. Right? And so we're building these connections. But then when they are talking to me like, it's so hard to try and make myself perfect. And I'll say, yes, I agree. It is so hard. Actually, it's impossible. Because if we're imperfect, because they all admit that they're imperfect, but the standard is perfection, then how can I, as an imperfect being, perfectly make myself perfect? I'd have to be perfect in order to do it perfectly. And they're sitting there going, yeah, something's missing. And then I get to invite them into, well, what if God's a being who loves you, who wants you to not turn into him, but remain you, and then he invites you into a relationship, and he died to make you perfect. You don't have to do it on your own. And you can almost sometimes literally see them relax. And now I didn't have to bash Buddhism. I don't want to bash Buddhism. There's so many beautiful truths in Buddhism. But I got to invite this student to honor their tradition and their family, but then say, look at this. God's going to offer you perfection as a gift because he died for you out of his love for you. And they're sitting there saying, well, can I have that? They want it because they get to have integrity for what they have carried the truth with, but they've also known like there's something missing here, and I get to invite them to connect that.
Well, and again, what you're trying to do is help them to see that each particular worldview, if it's based upon human reason rather than God's revelation, at some point is not going to correspond with logic, with reason, with reality. And so you're helping them in a gentle sort of way to see the disconnect. But you also have a chapter on the power of paradox. What about that?
Well, I think, we didn't talk about monism there, but in monism, we're believing that everything is united, right?
Right.
Okay, I don't want to deny that truth. I think for some of us, it's, easy to say, well, whoa, we're going to get into pantheism there if I say everything's united. But at the same time, we read Paul that says we're all united in Christ. So it's
of course, yeah.
So I do that. And I think if we try to say, well, okay, so then we're all united in Christ and we're distinct. If we don't hold paradox here, then we're going to miss out on both of those truths. There's a mystery here. I encourage my students to embrace that mystery.
Sure.
Lewis says if we could figure it all out, then we would be God. So it's okay to not have it all figured out. But by holding the paradox that we are all united and we are also distinct, then I get to hold on to both of those truths and celebrate them, and even invite the monists into celebrating distinction, which I think intuitively they want to hold on to distinction as well.
So again, the way you put the book together, there's kind of 3 parts, 22 chapters, and it does seem to me, Matthew, that individuals can read through this. Any teacher listening right now that has been wanting to teach worldview might want to benefit from that. Of course, they certainly have depended in the past on James Sire's books and those kinds of things, but this is kind of another and a very unique way to teach that. So whether you're teaching in a Christian school, and they may be listening right now, whether they're a Sunday school teacher, a Bible fellowship teacher, maybe even a pastor, this is another resource. And since the book has just come out, I wanted people to know about it. It is published by Tyndale. As I said, about 200 pages, 22 chapters, and if nothing else, from your own experience of teaching at Wheaton Academy, we have been able to benefit from that. And so I want to say thank you so very much, not only for writing the book, but for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby.
Let me encourage you to find out more about this book. We have a link to that so that if you would want to get it in paperback or Kindle, I think there's an audiobook even going to be coming out. There's some other resources there, so we have some links for you to follow there as well. And it's really an attempt to try to unpack some of the concepts and some of the worldviews and ideas that people have as they perceive the world. So what we did was talk about kind of these 4 kind of philosophical broad worldviews and then see how they answer those 7 questions. And then Matthew goes back and spends a little bit of time helping you understand how you might be able to use this in an effective way, not to bash others, not to criticize them, but to open up a conversation and help them to see that maybe the worldview that is part of their perspective of the world is inadequate in one way or another. Not to be critical of them, but to point them to a greater truth, and that is the light of Jesus Christ. So again, the book is entitled Inklings on Philosophy and Worldview, a new way of learning about our connections to truth and reality. And you've been listening to Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.